The crystal champagne flute slipped from Grace Washington's weathered fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a cascade of golden Dom Perignon that spread like spilled sunlight across the Sterling Financial Tower's 47th floor. William Sterling IV froze mid-conversation with Japanese investors, his face contorting with the kind of rage reserved for those who believe their wealth makes them untouchable. "I'll marry you if you dance this tango," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the shocked silence of 300 elite guests like a blade through silk. The orchestra's music screeched to a halt. Crystal glasses clinked as trembling hands set them down. Someone's gasp echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Manhattan's glittering skyline. Grace stood motionless in her faded blue uniform, 67 years of invisible servitude suddenly thrust into blinding spotlight. Her arthritic hands should have been shaking. Any woman her age would be trembling after such public humiliation, but they remained steady as a surgeon's. The crowd's laughter began as nervous chuckles building into cruel crescendo. But William Sterling had just made the most expensive mistake of his privileged life. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Along with the city you're watching from now, let's continue with the story. Grace Washington had been invisible for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. She knew because she'd been counting, not the days until freedom, but the days since anyone had truly seen her as human. Tonight, under the crystal chandeliers of Sterling Financial Tower's executive floor, that invisibility was about to shatter like the champagne glass at her feet. The autumn evening had started like any other shift. Grace arrived at 9 p.m. sharp, her security badge granting access to floors most New Yorkers would never see. 47 stories above the city that never sleeps, she moved through marble corridors like a ghost, her rubber-soled shoes silent against polished floors that cost more per square foot than most people's annual rent. At 67, Grace carried herself with an unconscious elegance that her faded uniform couldn't disguise. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, revealing a face that bore the refined bone structure of someone who'd once commanded stages. But those days were buried deeper than Manhattan bedrock, hidden beneath decades of survival and necessity. The Sterling Financial Tower represented everything Grace had once danced around but never truly possessed: generational wealth, unquestioned power, and the kind of privilege that turned human beings into furniture. William Sterling IV embodied that privilege. At 45, he'd inherited not just his family's real estate empire, but their casual cruelty toward anyone they deemed beneath them. Grace had observed William for 3 years through the lens of servitude. She'd cleaned his office at 3 a.m., emptied his trash, and witnessed his phone calls where he spoke about those people with the kind of venom that suggested personal wounds festering beneath his tailored suits. She knew about his mother's death when he was 7. The hushed conversations among senior staff spoke of suicide, scandal, and a family secret that had shaped William into the man who now stood before her, rage radiating from his perfectly pressed tuxedo. The gala was Sterling Financial's annual charity auction, a gathering where Manhattan's elite gathered to bid on art while congratulating themselves on their philanthropy. Grace had worked dozens of these events, watching from the shadows as couples danced to orchestras that cost more than her yearly salary. She'd learned to time her cleaning around the evening's rhythm: cocktails at 7, dinner at 8, dancing until midnight. Tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way the October wind rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows, or how the city lights seemed to pulse with unusual energy. Or maybe it was the small rebellion Grace had allowed herself, humming Chopin while she worked, letting muscle memory guide her movements in ways that would have seemed impossible for a janitor if anyone had been watching. But someone was always watching. and William Sterling IV had been watching Grace with the kind of attention that comes from deep-seated prejudice mixed with something darker, a need to prove his superiority over those he'd been taught to despise. The champagne glass had been an accident. What came next would be anything but. The silence that followed the shattering glass felt like the moment before lightning strikes, charged with electricity and inevitability. Grace remained frozen in the center of the marble floor, surrounded by champagne and crystal fragments that caught the chandelier light like scattered diamonds. 300 pairs of eyes bore into her with the weight of judgment, curiosity, and barely concealed contempt. William Sterling IV stepped forward, his Italian leather shoes crunching on crystal shards with the deliberate precision of a predator circling wounded prey. The Japanese investors he'd been courting, a deal worth $800 million, watched with the polite discomfort of people witnessing a public execution they hadn't paid to see. 3 years, William announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone born into power. 3 years this woman has worked in my building, and she's still a walking disaster. He gestured toward Grace with theatrical disgust. Ladies and gentlemen, I present our stellar cleaning crew, proof that some people simply can't be trained for civilized society. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Grace felt each chuckle as a physical blow, but something deeper stirred within her. Not shame, but a familiar steel that had once carried her through 15-minute standing ovations at Lincoln Center. Her grandmother's voice echoed from memory. Baby girl, they can take your money, your home, even your dreams, but they can't take your backbone unless you hand it to them. I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling, Grace said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm building in her chest. I'll clean this up right away and deduct the cost from my paycheck. Oh no, William smiled with the cold calculation of a man who'd found his evening's entertainment. That won't be nearly enough. Do you know what those bottles cost? $500 each. That's more than you make in a month. He paused, letting the financial disparity sink into the crowd's consciousness. But I'm feeling generous tonight. He walked to the sound system, where the evening's playlist waited on standby. With deliberate ceremony, he selected a track that made Grace's blood freeze in her veins. Por una cabeza, the tango that had once been her signature piece, the dance that had launched her career at American Ballet Theatre 30 years ago. The opening notes filled the air with their haunting melody, and Grace's body responded before her mind could stop it. Her spine straightened imperceptibly, her feet shifted into a subtle first position that no one would notice unless they knew what to look for. The music called to muscles that remembered, to a soul that had never truly forgotten how to fly. This, William announced with sadistic glee, is one of the most sophisticated art forms in human civilization. The Argentine tango, music for refined people, cultured people, people who understand true artistry. He turned to face Grace directly, his eyes glittering with malicious intent. I'll make you a deal, sweetheart. If you can dance this tango, and I mean really dance it, not shuffle around like the cleaning lady you are, I'll not only forgive the cost of the champagne, I'll marry you right here, right now. The explosion of laughter was deafening. 300 voices rose in hysteria, applause, shouts of, "Do it!" and "This is better than Broadway." Cell phones appeared like magic, recording what promised to be the most viral humiliation video of the year. The elite of Manhattan had found their gladiator sport, and Grace Washington was about to be fed to the lions. William continued his performance, feeding off the crowd's energy like a politician at a rally. Imagine the headlines. Billionaire CEO marries janitor who breaks his champagne. Can you picture it, folks? This woman who can barely hold a mop dancing the tango? He gestured toward Grace with theatrical contempt. Look at her. Really look. Does anyone here believe this woman has ever danced anything more complex than the hokey pokey at a church social? The crowd's amusement intensified. Caroline Blackwood, wife of a Supreme Court justice, shouted through tears of laughter, "William, you're terrible. She probably doesn't even know what a tango is." But as the laughter swirled around her like a tornado of cruelty, something extraordinary happened to Grace Washington. The humiliation that should have crushed her began to transform into something else entirely, a familiar fire she hadn't felt in 20 years. Her hands, which should have been trembling with age and embarrassment, remained perfectly still. Her breathing, which should have been shallow with panic, deepened with the measured control of a performer preparing for the stage. She looked up at William Sterling IV, this man-child who had never known real adversity, who confused inherited wealth with personal worth, who had just made the mistake of awakening a sleeping lioness. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet dignity that cut through the crowd's noise like a blade through silk. "Mr. Sterling," Grace said, her words precisely enunciated, "are you making this offer officially, in front of all these witnesses?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, and for the first time in the evening, William Sterling IV felt a flicker of uncertainty. There was something in Grace Washington's voice, a clarity, a precision, that didn't match the profile of a bumbling janitor he'd constructed in his mind. The way she'd phrased her question suggested someone familiar with contracts, with the weight of witnessed agreements. "Of course I'm making it officially," William replied, his bravado masking the subtle shift he felt in the room's energy. "In front of 300 of Manhattan's finest witnesses." He spread his arms wide, playing to his audience. "If this woman can dance a proper tango, and I mean proper, not some shuffling around, I will marry her tonight and throw in $20,000 as a wedding gift." The crowd erupted again, but Grace barely heard them. Something profound was happening to her, a transformation that began in her bones and radiated outward. 20 years of suppressed identity were rising to the surface like oil through water. Her muscles remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Her spine straightened with the regal bearing that had once commanded the respect of critics from Moscow to Milan. 20,000? Grace repeated, and there was something almost playful in her tone that made several guests lean forward unconsciously. "Mr. Sterling, for a man of your supposed sophistication, that seems like a rather modest wager for something you consider impossible." William's eyes narrowed. This wasn't going according to script. The woman was supposed to stammer, perhaps cry, certainly run away in embarrassment. She wasn't supposed to negotiate. "Fine," he snapped, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. 50,000. But when you humiliate yourself, and you will, I want you to apologize to every person in this room for wasting their time." "Agreed," Grace said without hesitation. "But I have one condition." The audacity of it, a janitor setting conditions for a billionaire, sent murmurs through the crowd like wind through leaves. William's face flushed red above his bow tie. "You're not in a position to make conditions, sweetheart." Grace smiled then, and it was the smile of someone who had just remembered exactly who she was. "Oh, but I am, Mr. Sterling. You see, you've just made a binding verbal contract in front of 300 witnesses, including at least 40 attorneys. If I perform to standard, you owe me $50,000 and a wedding ceremony. But if I exceed standard, if I dance better than you expect, then I want you to double the foundation's annual charity contribution and make a public apology for your treatment of service workers." The room fell silent. This was no longer entertainment. This had become serious business. Judge Margaret Harrison, sitting at table 12, nodded approvingly at Grace's contract language. Several other legal minds in the room exchanged glances of professional respect. William felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. You want to bankrupt my charity over a dance? Fine. But let's be clear about what exceeding standard means. I've seen professional tango dancers, real ones. If you want to play in that league, you better bring more than beginner's luck. Define professional, Grace said quietly. William's smile returned, sharp as a blade. Lincoln Center level, American Ballet Theater quality. That's the standard for exceeding expectations. The words hit Grace like a physical blow, not because they intimidated her, but because they brought back memories so vivid she could smell the rosin and hear the orchestra tuning. Lincoln Center, the Metropolitan Opera House, stages where she had been not just a dancer but a goddess in motion, commanding audiences with every breath. Without a word, Grace bent down and began untying her practical work shoes. The gesture was so unexpected, so deliberate, that conversation ceased entirely. 300 people watched as she removed her shoes and stood barefoot on the cold marble, her feet naturally falling into a perfect fifth position that spoke of decades of training. "What the hell is she doing?" someone whispered. But the whisper carried in the sudden silence. Grace closed her eyes and listened to the music, really listened. Por una cabeza filled her consciousness, bringing with it the ghost of every tango she'd ever danced. She remembered her first performance of this piece in 1983, partnered with Roberto Martinez at the Kennedy Center. She remembered the standing ovation, the roses, the review in the Washington Post that called her a force of nature wrapped in silk and starlight. When she opened her eyes, the woman standing in the center of the Sterling Financial Tower's marble floor was no longer Grace Washington, night janitor. She was Graciela Esperanza Washington, the first African-American principal dancer ever to perform the lead tango role with American Ballet Theater, the woman who had brought critics to tears and audiences to their feet from New York to Buenos Aires. Her first movement was subtle, just a shift of weight from one foot to the other, but it carried such precision, such controlled power, that several guests audibly gasped. Her arms rose with liquid grace, her head tilted with the exact angle that photographers had once called the Washington signature. The transformation was so complete, so shocking, that William actually took a step backward. This wasn't possible. Cleaning ladies didn't move like that. Poor people didn't carry themselves with such aristocratic bearing. The world he understood, where wealth equaled worth and position determined ability, suddenly felt as fragile as the champagne glass that had started it all. Grace began to dance, and with her first step, every assumption in the room shattered like crystal against marble. This wasn't a janitor pretending to dance. This was a master returning to her art, a queen reclaiming her throne, a phoenix rising from 20 years of ashes. The silence was deafening. 300 people held their breath as they witnessed the impossible becoming inevitable, and William Sterling IV realized he had just awakened something he was completely unprepared to face. Grace moved like liquid poetry given human form. Her bare feet glided across the marble with the whisper-soft precision of someone who had spent decades training on stages where a single misstep could end careers. The tango's opening measures flowed through her body like electricity through copper wire, every muscle responding to rhythms it had never truly forgotten, only temporarily buried beneath years of necessity and survival. The transformation was so complete that several guests rubbed their eyes, certain they were witnessing some elaborate illusion. This couldn't be the same woman who had been emptying their trash cans and cleaning their bathrooms. The posture alone, spine straight as a cathedral spire, shoulders held with regal bearing, arms moving with the fluid grace of a master calligrapher, spoke of training that began in childhood and had been refined through decades of professional performance. William Sterling IV stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, as Grace executed a series of walking steps that would have challenged dancers half her age. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, infused with the kind of emotional depth that separated true artists from mere technicians. Her feet found the floor with cat-like precision, her weight shifting with the subtle complexity that made tango the most demanding of all ballroom forms. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Margaret Harrison, the federal judge whose own daughter had studied ballet for 15 years. "I know professional technique when I see it. This woman isn't just dancing, she's performing." The crowd's laughter had died completely, replaced by something far more unsettling for people accustomed to certainty: confusion. The social order they understood, where economic position reflected personal worth and service workers were inherently lesser beings, was cracking like ice in spring. Some guests leaned forward, unconsciously, drawn by the magnetic presence Grace commanded. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing that their worldview was under assault. Grace herself was experiencing something akin to resurrection. 23 years had passed since she'd last performed professionally, but her body remembered everything: the exact angle of the cabeceo, the precise timing of the parada, the way weight should transfer from ball to heel in a perfect voleo. More than technique, though, she remembered what it felt like to be seen, truly seen, not as furniture or function, but as an artist worthy of attention and respect. As she moved into the dance's more complex passages, memories flooded back with painful clarity. She remembered her debut performance of this very piece in 1981 at Lincoln Center, partnered with Carlos Menendez before an audience that included Agnes DeMille and Martha Graham. The Times critic had written, "Miss Washington doesn't merely dance the tango, she becomes it, transforming technique into truth, movement into meaning." The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now performing the same piece for an audience that had, moments before, considered her incapable of basic competence. But as Grace spun through a series of giros that demonstrated perfect balance and control, something darker began to emerge from her subconscious. The music, the movement, the spotlight of attention, it all combined to unlock a memory she'd spent decades trying to suppress. She was back in Buenos Aires in 1994, the night everything changed, the night that had ultimately led her to this marble floor 29 years later. She had been performing with the International Dance Company, a touring troupe that was attempting to bridge racial and cultural divides through dance. The audience that night included diplomats, celebrities, and cultural leaders from across South America. Among them had been a young American businessman named James Sterling III, William's father, who had approached her after the performance with what seemed like genuine admiration for her artistry. What followed was a relationship that had lasted 6 months. 6 months, during which Grace believed she had found not just love, but understanding. James had seemed different from other wealthy men she'd encountered, more sensitive to issues of equality and justice. He had spoken passionately about using his family's resources to support arts programs for underserved communities. He had promised her a future that honored both her talent and her heritage. The relationship had ended abruptly when James's family discovered his involvement with that black dancer. The Sterling family, with their old-money Manhattan roots and carefully curated social circles, had threatened disinheritance and social exile if James didn't end the relationship immediately. Grace had learned about the ultimatum not from James himself, but from a society columnist who had called her for comment on the mixed-race scandal that's rocking Manhattan's elite. James had chosen his inheritance over her love, his family's approval over their shared dreams. But before he disappeared from her life completely, he had done something that Grace had never forgiven. He had told his family that she was a gold digger who had deliberately targeted him for his wealth, a calculating woman who used her exotic appeal to manipulate wealthy white men. The lie had spread through Manhattan's social circles like wildfire, destroying not only Grace's reputation, but her ability to secure funding for the arts education programs she'd been developing. Grants were withdrawn, partnerships dissolved, opportunities evaporated. Within a year, Grace's career was effectively over, not due to age or injury, but because of whispered rumors about her character. Now, as she danced for James Sterling's son, Grace felt the full weight of that historical irony. William's hatred for black women hadn't emerged from nowhere. It had been cultivated by his father's cowardice and lies, fed by family stories that painted Grace as the villain in a drama where she had actually been the victim. The music reached its climactic passage, and Grace poured 29 years of suppressed pain into her performance. Every step became an act of defiance, every turn a rejection of the labels that had been forced upon her. She wasn't dancing just for herself now. She was dancing for every woman who had been diminished by powerful men's fears, every person whose worth had been questioned based on their appearance or position. The technical complexity of her performance was staggering. She executed a series of boleos that required perfect timing and balance, followed by a dramatic corte that showcased the flexibility she'd maintained despite her age. But beyond technique, there was something else, an emotional intensity that transformed the dance from performance to confession, from entertainment to testimony. Several guests were openly weeping now, though they couldn't articulate why. Judge Harrison, who had seen countless performances at Lincoln Center, whispered to her husband, "I haven't seen dancing this powerful since Alicia Alonso." Even some of William's closest allies were beginning to shift uncomfortably, sensing that their host's cruelty had unleashed something they weren't prepared to witness. Marcus Johnson, the successful corporate lawyer seated at table 7, found himself inexplicably moved by Grace's performance. There was something familiar about her movement, something that resonated in his bones despite his inability to identify the source. He'd been adopted as an infant and had always felt a mysterious pull toward dance, though his adoptive parents had steered him toward more practical pursuits like law. Watching Grace, he felt an ache he couldn't name, a sense of recognition that defied logic. William, meanwhile, was experiencing something approaching panic. This wasn't possible. The woman he'd dismissed as incompetent, hired help, was demonstrating skills that surpassed most professionals he'd seen. Worse, there was something about her face, her bone structure, that triggered a dim memory from his childhood. Something about his father's business trips to South America, something about a dancer who had caused family turmoil he'd been too young to understand. As Grace moved into the dance's final section, her movements became even more emotionally charged. She was dancing not just her own story now, but the stories of all the invisible people who cleaned offices and served meals and maintained the infrastructure that allowed the wealthy to pursue their comfortable delusions of superiority. Each step was a reclamation, each turn a revolution. The music built to its crescendo, and Grace prepared for the final dramatic conclusion that had once brought audiences to their feet across 2 continents. But as she positioned herself for the closing sequence, something unexpected happened. The emotional intensity of the performance, combined with the stress of 23 years of suppressed identity, caused her heart to skip irregularly. She felt a flutter in her chest, a moment of dizziness that threatened to end her comeback before it reached its climax. For a terrifying instant, Grace realized she might collapse before completing the dance, might literally die in the attempt to reclaim her dignity. But then she heard her grandmother's voice again, strong and clear across the decades. "Baby girl, we don't get to choose our trials, but we do get to choose how we face them. You dance like your life depends on it, because sometimes it does." Grace steadied herself, drew upon reserves of strength she'd forgotten she possessed, and prepared for the finale that would either resurrect Graciela Esperanza Washington or bury her forever. The final measures of Por una Cabeza filled the Sterling Financial Tower's 47th floor like a prayer ascending to heaven. Grace Washington summoned every ounce of strength her 67-year-old body possessed, channeling decades of muscle memory, professional training, and sheer force of will into the dance's climactic sequence. Her heart hammered against her ribs with dangerous irregularity, but she pushed forward, driven by something deeper than physical endurance, the desperate need to reclaim not just her dignity, but her very identity. She executed the final series of turns with breathtaking precision, each rotation controlled and deliberate despite the tremor she felt in her left leg. The marble floor that had seemed so treacherous moments before now felt like home beneath her bare feet. As the music swelled toward its conclusion, Grace positioned herself for the dramatic chord that had once been her signature, a backbend so deep and sustained that photographers had compared it to a flower blooming in reverse. The silence in the room was absolute. 300 of Manhattan's most powerful individuals held their breath as Grace arched backward in a display of flexibility that defied every assumption they'd made about aging, about class, about what was possible for someone they'd dismissed as mere hired help. Her spine curved in a perfect arc, her arms extended with the grace of a swan's wings, her face turned upward toward the chandelier lights as if reaching for something divine. For a suspended moment that felt like eternity, Grace held the pose. Then, with control that spoke of decades of professional training, she slowly returned to vertical, her movement so fluid it seemed to reverse time itself. As the final notes of the tango faded into silence, she stood motionless in the center of the marble floor, her chest rising and falling with measured breaths, her eyes closed in what looked like prayer. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came the sound of slow clapping. It was Judge Margaret Harrison, her face streaked with tears, applauding with the deliberate rhythm of someone who recognized greatness when she saw it. The clapping spread like ripples on a pond, first to the other legal professionals who understood the gravity of what they'd witnessed, then to the arts patrons who recognized technical mastery, then to everyone else who simply knew they'd seen something extraordinary. Within moments, the entire room erupted in applause that rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows. People were standing, cheering, some crying openly. It wasn't just appreciation for a good performance. It was the kind of ovation reserved for moments that change everything, that shatter preconceptions and demand a fundamental reassessment of reality. Grace opened her eyes slowly, as if awakening from a dream. The transformation she'd undergone during the dance began to reverse. Not back to the invisible janitor she'd been an hour ago, but into something new, something that bridged her past glory and present circumstances. She was still 67 years old, still wearing a faded uniform, still economically vulnerable. But she was no longer invisible, no longer diminished by others' assumptions. William Sterling IV stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of confusion, shock, and something approaching terror. This wasn't supposed to happen. His carefully ordered world, where wealth equaled worth and social position determined ability, had just collapsed around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. The woman he'd dismissed as incompetent had just delivered a performance that surpassed anything he'd ever seen at Lincoln Center or the Metropolitan Opera House. But it was more than just the technical brilliance that shook him. There was something about Grace's face, something about the way she held herself, that triggered memories he'd spent decades trying to suppress. Images flashed through his mind. His father's mysterious trips to South America in the 1990s, hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly when young William entered the room, his mother's increasing depression and isolation during that same period. "My God," whispered Caroline Blackwood, the Supreme Court Justice's wife who had been laughing cruelly just minutes before. "I've never seen anything like that." She's not just good, she's phenomenal. Professional level doesn't begin to describe what we just witnessed, Doctor. Patricia Chen, a renowned arts critic for the New York Times who happened to be attending as someone's guest, was frantically taking notes on her phone. She'd reviewed dance performances for 20 years and recognized something historic when she saw it. "That wasn't just a dance," she murmured to her companion. "That was a resurrection. I need to know who this woman is." Marcus Johnson found himself standing without realizing he'd risen from his seat, tears streaming down his face for reasons he couldn't articulate. The performance had triggered something deep within him, a sense of connection that defied rational explanation. As a successful corporate lawyer, he prided himself on logical thinking, but watching Grace dance had awakened an emotional response that bypassed his intellect entirely. Grace herself was struggling with the aftermath of what she'd just accomplished. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was beginning to fade, leaving behind the reality of her situation. She'd just revealed herself to 300 strangers, exposed the carefully guarded secret she'd protected for 2 decades. There would be questions now, investigations into her past, scrutiny of the choices that had led her from prima ballerina to night janitor. But as she looked around the room at faces that now regarded her with respect rather than dismissal, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope, not just for herself, but for the possibility that people could change, that assumptions could be challenged, that dignity could be reclaimed even in the most unlikely circumstances. William slowly approached her, his movements uncertain for the first time in his adult life. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, everyone sensing the dramatic importance of this moment. When he reached Grace, he stood before her in silence for several heartbeats, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He began, then stopped, seemingly at a loss for words. The contract he'd so confidently made, $50,000 plus doubling the foundation's charitable contributions, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of what had just occurred. He'd wagered money on humiliating a woman he'd considered beneath him, only to discover that she possessed gifts that dwarfed his own accomplishments. "You exceeded professional standard," Judge Harrison called out from the crowd, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making binding pronouncements. "By any measure, what we just witnessed surpassed Lincoln Center quality. The contract terms have been met and exceeded." Grace nodded slowly, her breathing finally returning to normal. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room, "I believe you owe me an explanation and payment for services rendered. But more than that, you owe these people and yourself the truth about who you really are and why you needed to diminish me to feel important." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Everyone present sensed that this wasn't really about money or contracts or even dance. This was about something deeper, about the stories we tell ourselves to justify cruelty, about the assumptions that allow decent people to treat others as less than human, about the courage required to face uncomfortable truths about power and privilege. William looked around the room at faces that had always shown him deference and respect, now looking at him with something approaching disappointment. For the first time in his life, his wealth and position couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. He'd gambled everything on the certainty that Grace Washington was exactly what she appeared to be, nothing more than hired help who knew her place. He'd been catastrophically wrong, and now he had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be in the aftermath of that mistake. The weight of 300 stairs pressed down on William Sterling IV like a physical force. But it was the expression in Grace Washington's eyes that truly unnerved him. There was no triumph there, no vindictive satisfaction at having exposed his cruelty. Instead, he saw something far more unsettling: pity. She looked at him the way one might regard a wounded animal. Dangerous, perhaps, but ultimately more pathetic than threatening. "The payment can wait," Grace said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgeon's blade. "What I want to know is why. Why did you need to humiliate me? What did I represent to you that required such enthusiastic destruction?" William's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around him, the cream of Manhattan society waited for an answer he didn't possess. The truth that her skin color triggered something primal and ugly in him, something inherited from family dinner conversations and whispered warnings about those people, felt too shameful to voice in this glittering room full of witnesses. But Grace wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the marble, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding stages. "You know, Mr. Sterling, I've been cleaning your office for 3 years. I've seen the photographs on your desk, your father, your mother, family portraits going back generations. Beautiful woman, your mother. She had such sad eyes in those later pictures." William's face drained of color. "Don't you dare talk about my mother." "Elizabeth Sterling," Grace continued, her tone conversational but her eyes never leaving his face. "Born Elizabeth Hartford in 1952, graduated from Vassar in 1974 with a degree in art history. Married your father in 1976, died by her own hand in 1987 when you were 7 years old." The room had gone deadly quiet. Even the soft jazz playing in the background seemed to fade into nothingness. William felt his knees weaken as memories he'd spent 36 years suppressing crashed over him like a tsunami. "How do you know that?" he whispered. Grace's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Because I was there, William. Not at the end. God knows I tried to prevent that. But I was there during the months when your mother was fighting for her life, her sanity, her marriage." The words hit William like physical blows. "That's impossible. You're lying." "Buenos Aires, 1986, Grace said, her voice growing stronger. "The International Cultural Exchange Program. Your father was there on business, expanding Sterling Financial into South American markets. Your mother was there because she'd discovered his affairs and insisted on accompanying him, hoping a change of scenery might save their marriage." Marcus Johnson found himself leaning forward in his seat, drawn by something in Grace's tone that seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart. Other guests were whispering among themselves, trying to piece together the implications of what they were hearing. Grace continued, her words measured but relentless. "I was performing with the International Dance Company that season. Your mother attended several of our performances. She loved the arts, you know. We struck up a friendship. She was so lonely, William, so desperate to connect with someone who saw her as more than just an accessory to your father's empire." "Stop," William said. But there was no authority in his voice, only the broken plea of a man watching his carefully constructed reality crumble. "She told me about the affairs, about the way your father's family treated her like an embarrassment because she wasn't from old money. She told me about you, how bright you were, how much she loved you, how terrified she was that you'd grow up to be like him." Grace's voice cracked slightly. "She was so afraid you'd learn to hate the way he did." The revelation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several guests were openly staring now, recognizing the name Sterling from old society columns, remembering whispered scandals from decades past. William felt his world tilting on its axis. His father had told him a different story, that his mother's death had been triggered by stress from dealing with radical elements they'd encountered in South America, people who resented American business success. He'd been taught that certain kinds of people were naturally envious, naturally destructive to decent families. "You're lying," he repeated, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Grace reached into the pocket of her uniform and withdrew something that made William's breath catch in his throat. A small, faded photograph. She held it out to him, and with trembling fingers, he took it. The image was unmistakable. His mother, Elizabeth Sterling, looking younger and happier than he remembered, standing beside a strikingly beautiful black woman in ballet attire. Both women were smiling genuine smiles, their arms around each other's shoulders in obvious friendship. "She gave me this picture the last time we spoke," Grace said softly, 3 days before she died. "She'd tried to leave your father, William. She'd filed for divorce, was planning to take you and start over. But your father's family, they had resources your mother couldn't match. Lawyers, private investigators, threats about taking you away from her permanently." Judge Harrison was now standing, her legal mind processing the implications of what she was hearing. Other attorneys in the room were exchanging significant glances, understanding that they were witnessing the revelation of information that could have legal ramifications even decades later. "The night she died," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "she called me. She was hysterical. Said your father's family had threatened to destroy her in court to prove she was an unfit mother because of her associations with undesirable elements. They meant me, William. They meant our friendship." William stared at the photograph, his hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. In his mother's face he could see joy he'd never witnessed in person, a lightness that had been absent from his childhood memories. "She loved you so much," Grace said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Her last words to me were about you. She made me promise that if I ever had the chance, I'd tell you the truth about who she really was. Not the broken woman who couldn't fight anymore, but the brave, loving mother who would have done anything to protect you from becoming what she saw in your father." The room was now completely silent except for the sound of muffled sobs. Even some of the most hardened business leaders present were visibly moved by the raw emotion of the moment. William felt something breaking inside his chest, not his heart, but something deeper, the foundational lie upon which he'd built his entire identity. Every cruel word he'd spoken, every dismissive gesture, every moment of casual racism had been rooted in a story his father had told him about dangerous people who destroyed innocent families. But looking at this photograph, seeing his mother's genuine happiness in the company of the woman he'd just tried to humiliate, he realized he'd been living someone else's hate, carrying someone else's guilt. "She didn't leave me," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. "She never wanted to leave you," Grace said gently. "She wanted to save you. From the hate, from the cruelty, from becoming the kind of man who could look at another human being and see only their utility to your comfort." Marcus Johnson was now openly weeping, though he couldn't explain why this stranger's story affected him so deeply. Something about the way Grace spoke about lost children, about mothers who loved despite impossible circumstances, resonated in his bones. William looked up from the photograph to meet Grace's eyes, and in that moment, he saw not the enemy his father had taught him to fear, but the woman who had been his mother's only true friend in her darkest hour. The woman who had kept a promise for 36 years, waiting for the right moment to honor a dying woman's final wish. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. But even as the words left his mouth, William knew that apologies wouldn't be enough to undo 3 decades of learned hatred, wouldn't resurrect his mother, wouldn't give Grace back the 20 years she'd spent invisible and dismissed. The real question was what came next, and whether any of them were brave enough to find out. Grace watched William Sterling IV crumble before her eyes, his carefully constructed facade dissolving like sugar in rain. The photograph trembled in his hands as 36 years of manufactured hatred collapsed under the weight of truth. But as she observed his breakdown, Grace felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Not satisfaction, but a profound sadness for the little boy who had lost his mother and been fed poison disguised as love. "There's more, isn't there?" William whispered, his voice barely audible above the collective breathing of 300 stunned witnesses. "More you haven't told me." Grace hesitated. The truth she carried was radioactive, capable of destroying not just William's understanding of his past, but his entire sense of identity. Yet her promise to Elizabeth Sterling had been absolute, and promises to the dead carried a weight that the living could barely comprehend. "Your mother didn't just want to leave your father," Grace said quietly. "She wanted to take you somewhere safe, somewhere you could grow up without learning to hate. She'd been planning to move to California, had even put a deposit on a small house in Santa Barbara where she could teach art history at the local college." Marcus Johnson suddenly stood up from his table, his movement so abrupt that his chair toppled backward with a crash that echoed through the silent ballroom. His face had gone ashen, his eyes wide with something approaching recognition. "Santa Barbara," he whispered, the words carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Santa Barbara, 1987. Grace turned toward the sound of his voice, and when their eyes met across the crowded room, the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. There was something in Marcus's face, in the shape of his eyes, in the way he held his shoulders, that made Grace's heart stop beating for several crucial seconds. "How do you know about Santa Barbara?" William demanded, his grief temporarily replaced by confusion. Marcus moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker, his usual professional composure completely abandoned. When he reached Grace, he stood before her with tears streaming down his face, studying her features with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for 4 decades. "I was born in New York in 1981, Marcus said, his voice shaking. "Adopted at 3 months old by Jonathan and Margaret Johnson. But the adoption records, they were sealed, but I hired investigators. The birth mother was listed as a professional dancer who gave up her child because she couldn't provide adequate care while maintaining her career." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. The room began to spin slightly, and she had to grasp the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. 42 years. 42 years of wondering, of hoping, of imagining what her son might look like as a man. "The adoption agency was in Manhattan," Marcus continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The birth father was listed as unknown. The birth mother requested only that the child be told she loved him and that giving him up was the hardest thing she'd ever done. But she wanted him to have opportunities she couldn't provide." Judge Harrison was now openly weeping, recognizing the magnitude of what was unfolding. Several other guests had their phones out, not to record for social media, but because they understood they were witnessing something historically significant: the convergence of 3 lives that had been shaped by decisions made 4 decades earlier. Grace reached out with a trembling hand and touched Marcus's cheek, her fingers tracing features that were unmistakably her own, reflected in masculine form. "You became a lawyer," she whispered. "I always wondered. I always hoped you'd become something important, something that would make a difference. I specialize in family reunification cases," Marcus said, his voice breaking completely. "I help other people find their families. I've been looking for you my entire adult life, and you were cleaning buildings 20 blocks from my office." William Sterling IV stood forgotten for the moment, still clutching the photograph of his mother and Grace, watching this reunion unfold with a mixture of awe and devastation. The woman he'd tried to humiliate, the person he'd dismissed as worthless, hired help, had just been revealed as not only a world-class artist, but someone whose personal sacrifices had created one of Manhattan's most respected attorneys. But there was another revelation coming, one that would complete the circle of tragedy and redemption that had begun 36 years earlier. Grace turned back to William, her arm now around Marcus's shoulders, and spoke the words that would change everything. "William, there's something else your mother told me, something I promised I'd only share if I ever had the chance to prevent history from repeating itself." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "Your mother knew about Marcus. She knew I'd given up my son for adoption, and she was the one who helped arrange it." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have weight. William stared at Grace and Marcus, his mind struggling to process the implications. "She what?" William whispered. "Elizabeth had connections throughout Manhattan society, including on the boards of several adoption agencies. When I became pregnant in 1980, when my career was taking off, but I had no resources to raise a child alone, she helped me find a good family, the Johnsons. She vetted them personally, made sure they were kind people who would love Marcus and give him opportunities I couldn't provide." Marcus staggered slightly, overwhelmed by the realization that his adoption, the central mystery of his life, had been facilitated by a woman he'd never known existed. "She paid for everything," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger as she honored Elizabeth's memory. "The medical bills, the legal fees, even a trust fund that paid for Marcus's education. She made me promise never to contact him unless he sought me out first, but she also promised me she'd watch over him from a distance." William's legs gave out, and he sank into a nearby chair, the photograph still clutched in his hands. "My mother helped raise your son?" "She loved children so much," Grace said softly. "After watching what your father's family did to her, she was determined that at least one child would grow up with love instead of hate." Marcus was her secret project, her way of believing that the world could be better than what she'd experienced. Dr. Patricia Chen, the arts critic, was frantically taking notes, recognizing that she was witnessing a story that would reshape how people understood family, sacrifice, and the hidden connections that bind strangers together across decades. Marcus looked between Grace and William, pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. "The anonymous donations to my law school," he said suddenly, "the scholarship fund that paid for my final year, the legal internships that somehow became available just when I needed them. That was—" "Your mother," Grace said to William. "Elizabeth Sterling spent the last years of her life making sure Marcus would succeed, would become the kind of man she wished you could be, someone who used his advantages to help others rather than diminish them." The revelation hung in the air like incense, sacred and transformative. 3 lives had been shaped by one woman's desperate attempt to plant seeds of love in soil that had been poisoned by hatred and privilege. William looked up at Marcus, his mother's spiritual son, the child she'd nurtured from a distance while her own son learned cruelty from his father. "She loved you," he said quietly. "She loved you, and I never even knew you existed." "She loved us both," Grace said firmly. "Different kinds of love, but genuine. She just ran out of strength to fight for the world she wanted us to live in." Marcus extended his hand toward William, an offer of connection across the gulf of race and circumstance that had divided them. "Maybe it's not too late," he said. "Maybe we can still honor what she wanted." As William reached out to take Marcus's hand, Grace realized that Elizabeth Sterling's final wish was finally being fulfilled. Not just the reunion of a mother and son, but the possibility that her own son might learn to love instead of hate, to build instead of destroy. The moment their hands touched, 36 years of poison began its slow transformation into something that might eventually become healing. 6 months later, Grace Washington stood in the lobby of the newly established Elizabeth Sterling Foundation for Arts Education, watching construction workers put the finishing touches on a marble plaque that read, "In memory of Elizabeth Hartford Sterling, who believed every child deserves to dance." The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now the executive director of a foundation funded by the fortune of the man who had once tried to humiliate her, in honor of the woman whose friendship had sustained her through the darkest period of her life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After that pivotal evening at Sterling Financial Tower, William had suffered what his therapist diplomatically called a complete psychological restructuring. The revelation that his entire worldview had been built on his father's lies and guilt had sent him into a tailspin that required months of intensive counseling to navigate. Grace had found herself in the unexpected position of being his guide through the wreckage of his assumptions, not because she owed him anything, but because Elizabeth Sterling had once asked her to believe in the possibility of redemption. Marcus had been her anchor throughout the complex process of reclaiming their relationship. 42 years of separation couldn't be erased in a moment, but they'd begun building something new. Not the mother-son bond that might have been, but an adult friendship rooted in shared values and mutual respect. He'd moved his law practice to focus exclusively on family reunification and civil rights cases, using his considerable skills to help other families torn apart by circumstance and prejudice. The foundation occupied the entire 15th floor of Sterling Tower, transformed from executive offices into dance studios, music rooms, and classrooms where children from across Manhattan's 5 boroughs could study the arts regardless of their family's ability to pay. Grace had insisted on one non-negotiable requirement. Every child who entered the program would be taught that art belonged to everyone, that talent and passion mattered more than economic status or skin color. "Mrs. Washington?" A small voice interrupted her thoughts. Grace turned to see Amelia Rodriguez, an 8-year-old from the Bronx whose single mother worked 3 jobs to keep their family housed. The little girl's eyes sparkled with the same hunger Grace remembered from her own childhood, the desperate need to move, to express, to transform pain into something beautiful. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Miss Jennifer says I'm ready to start learning real ballet positions. The ones the professionals use." Amelia's voice carried a reverence that made Grace's chest tighten with recognition. She remembered that feeling, the moment when dance stopped being play and became possibility. Grace knelt down to Amelia's eye level, her 67-year-old joints protesting only slightly. "Then we'd better get you some proper shoes, hadn't we?" As she led Amelia toward the studio where 30 other children from diverse backgrounds were stretching at the bar, Grace reflected on the strange mathematics of redemption. The foundation served over 500 children now, but its impact rippled far beyond those numbers. Parents who had never set foot in Manhattan's cultural institutions were attending their children's recitals at Lincoln Center. Kids who had never imagined themselves as artists were winning scholarships to prestigious programs. Most importantly, children were learning to see beauty and potential in faces that didn't look like their own. William appeared in the studio doorway, no longer the polished predator she'd first encountered, but a man still learning how to carry the weight of inherited privilege responsibly. He visited the foundation weekly, not as a benefactor seeking gratitude, but as someone genuinely trying to understand how to use wealth as a tool for repair rather than separation. "How's the new program rollout going?" he asked, his tone carrying none of the condescension that had once defined his interactions with people he considered beneath him. "Better than projected," Grace replied, watching as Jennifer Martinez, a young Puerto Rican dancer she'd hired as head instructor, guided the children through their positions. "We've got a waiting list of over 300 kids. The Harlem expansion is scheduled to open next month, and the community response in Queens has been overwhelming." William nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "Grace, there's something I need to tell you." "My father. He's dying. Pancreatic cancer. He wants to see you." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. James Sterling III, The man who had abandoned her in Buenos Aires, who had destroyed her reputation to protect his family's social standing, who had poisoned his own son with lies about her character, was dying and wanted absolution she wasn't sure she could provide. "Why?" she asked, simply. "He says he needs to tell you the truth about what really happened with my mother. About why she... about why she couldn't fight anymore." William's voice cracked slightly. "He says you deserve to know that her death wasn't your fault." Grace felt tears she hadn't expected begin to blur her vision. For 36 years she'd carried the guilt that her friendship with Elizabeth had somehow contributed to her suicide. Even knowing that Elizabeth had been fighting battles Grace couldn't fully understand, she'd wondered if their connection had provided James Sterling III with the ammunition he'd needed to break his wife's spirit completely. "He's at Memorial Sloan Kettering," William continued. "Private room. He might not have much time left." Marcus appeared beside them, having overheard the conversation. As Grace's son and an attorney specializing in family law, he'd developed a protective instinct toward his birth mother that sometimes surprised them both. "You don't owe him anything," he said quietly. "You don't have to relive that trauma for his peace of mind." Grace watched the children in the studio, their young bodies learning to express emotions they didn't yet have words for, and thought about cycles, how hatred and love, trauma and healing could pass from generation to generation like genetic traits. Elizabeth Sterling had broken one cycle by ensuring Marcus grew up with love instead of poison. Grace herself had broken another by choosing forgiveness over revenge when William had tried to humiliate her. "Yes, I do," she said finally. "Not for him, but for her." Elizabeth died carrying secrets that weren't hers to bear. If there's a chance to set the record straight, to free her memory from whatever lies have been attached to it, then I owe her that much. 3 hours later, Grace sat beside the hospital bed of the man who had once promised her forever, and then disappeared when forever became inconvenient. James Sterling III looked nothing like the vibrant businessman she'd known in Buenos Aires. Cancer had reduced him to angles and shadows, but his eyes, William's eyes, still held the intelligence and manipulation that had once fooled her into believing he was different from other wealthy men who collected beautiful women like art. "Graciela," he whispered, using the name he'd called her during their brief romance when she'd still believed love could transcend the boundaries of race and class. "You came." "I came for Elizabeth," Grace said simply. "Whatever you need to say it. But don't pretend this is about anything other than clearing your conscience before you die." James Sterling III smiled weakly at her directness. "Still no patience for pleasantries, I see." He struggled to sit up slightly, his breathing labored but determined. "Elizabeth didn't kill herself because of you. She didn't kill herself because of our affair or because of anything you two shared." Grace waited, her hands folded in her lap, giving him no comfort but also no additional pain. "She killed herself because of what I did afterward," he continued. "When my family found out about us, when they threatened disinheritance, I didn't just end our relationship. I told them you'd been blackmailing me, threatening to go public with our affair unless I left Elizabeth and married you." The revelation hit Grace like ice water, but she remained silent. "Elizabeth knew it was a lie," James continued, his voice growing weaker. "She knew you'd never do something like that. But my family used the story to justify destroying your reputation, to make sure you could never work in arts funding again. And Elizabeth, she blamed herself. She thought if she'd been a better wife, a stronger woman, I wouldn't have strayed. She thought our marriage failing was her fault, and your career being ruined was collateral damage from her inadequacy as a spouse." Grace felt the final piece of a 36-year-old puzzle click into place. Elizabeth hadn't died from shame about their friendship. She'd died from guilt about Grace's destroyed career, believing that her failure to hold her husband's attention had led to an innocent woman's professional ruin. "She tried to fight for you," James whispered. "She contacted galleries, foundations, tried to repair your reputation, but my family's influence was too extensive. Every door she opened, they closed. She died, thinking she'd failed you, failed our son, failed everyone she'd ever tried to protect." As James Sterling III drew his last breath 2 hours later, Grace realized that Elizabeth Sterling's final gift to her wasn't just the truth, but the understanding that redemption sometimes takes decades to arrive, and healing can begin at any age. The cycle was finally, completely broken. 2 years after James Sterling III's deathbed confession, Grace Washington stood before a full-length mirror in her modest but comfortable apartment, adjusting the collar of a navy blue dress she'd bought for a very special occasion. At 69, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to honor her body's limitations while refusing to be defined by them. Today marked the second anniversary of the Elizabeth Sterling Foundation, but more importantly, it was the day she would marry Dr. Robert Chen, the Foundation's volunteer physician who had stolen her heart with his quiet kindness and shared commitment to serving others. The journey to this moment had been as unlikely as everything else in Grace's extraordinary second act. Robert, a widowed cardiologist whose own wife had died 5 years earlier, had volunteered at the foundation initially to honor his late spouse's memory. She had been a dance teacher before her illness, and Robert found solace in watching children discover the same joy and movement that had defined his marriage. He'd noticed Grace immediately, not as a romantic prospect, but as someone who carried herself with a dignity that seemed to transcend her circumstances. Their friendship had developed slowly, built on shared morning coffee breaks between his volunteer sessions and her administrative duties. Robert never saw her as the former prima ballerina or the inspirational foundation director. He saw her as Grace, a woman who brought him peace after years of grief. When he'd finally worked up the courage to ask her to dinner, she'd laughed and told him she hadn't been on a date in over 20 years. His response, that he hadn't either so they could figure it out together, had sealed their fate. Marcus had walked her down the aisle at their small ceremony in the Foundation's main studio, with William Sterling serving as an unlikely but sincere best man. The guest list read like a testament to the power of second chances. Children from the Foundation's programs, their families, colleagues from the arts community who had rediscovered Grace after decades of assuming she was dead, and even some of the Sterling Tower cleaning staff who had become genuine friends rather than invisible colleagues. The Foundation itself had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. What had started as William's desperate attempt at redemption had evolved into a nationally recognized model for arts education that served over 2,000 children across 3 states. Grace had been featured on 60 Minutes, profiled in the New York Times, and invited to speak at arts conferences from Los Angeles to London. But the recognition that meant the most to her came from simpler sources. The little girl from the Bronx who'd earned a scholarship to Juilliard, the teenage boy from Queens who'd discovered his calling as a choreographer, the single mother from Harlem who'd found community and support while her daughter learned ballet. William himself had undergone the most dramatic transformation of anyone in Grace's orbit. Therapy, meditation, and a genuine commitment to understanding the systemic nature of racism had slowly chipped away at the entitled cruelty that had once defined him. He'd married Maria Santos, a Puerto Rican social worker he'd met through the foundation, and together they'd started a family that would never know the poisonous worldview that had shaped his early years. Their daughter, Elizabeth Maria Sterling, carried her grandmother's name and her father's commitment to breaking generational cycles of harm. But perhaps the most profound change in Grace's life was the simple recognition that she was no longer invisible. At 69, she was more seen, more valued, more celebrated than she'd ever been at the height of her ballet career. The difference was that now she was valued not just for her talent, but for her wisdom, her compassion, her ability to help others recognize their own worth. The irony wasn't lost on her that it had taken a millionaire's cruel joke to restore her sense of purpose. That night on the marble floor of Sterling Tower, when she'd chosen dignity over safety, had been the moment her real life began again. Everything before, the career, the heartbreak, the decades of invisibility, had been preparation for this chapter where she could use her experience to lift others. Dr. Patricia Chen, the arts critic who had witnessed Grace's resurrection that night, had written a book about the incident titled The Janitor Who Danced, A Story of Hidden Grace. The bestseller had sparked national conversations about how society treats service workers, about the stories we tell ourselves to justify inequality, about the human cost of casual cruelty. But Grace's favorite review had come from a cleaning lady in Phoenix who'd written, "This story made me remember that I matter too." Marcus had thrived in his role as not just Grace's son, but as her partner in expanding the Foundation's mission. His legal expertise had been crucial in navigating the complex regulations around arts funding and child services, but more importantly, his presence had given Grace something she'd never expected to have again: family. They'd developed their own traditions, Sunday dinners where they'd cook together and share stories about their weeks, monthly visits to Broadway shows where Grace would point out technical details that escaped most audiences, quiet conversations about the parents who'd shaped them and the choices that had led them to each other. The Foundation's success had opened doors Grace had assumed were permanently closed. Lincoln Center had invited her to choreograph a piece celebrating the diversity of American dance, and she'd created a work that featured children from the Foundation alongside professional dancers, blurring the lines between amateur and professional, between worthy and unworthy of artistic expression. The piece, titled Second Chances, had received a 10-minute standing ovation and had been filmed for PBS, reaching audiences across the country with its message of redemption and possibility. But the moment that had moved Grace most deeply came 6 months earlier, when Amelia Rodriguez, the 8-year-old from the Bronx who'd asked about real ballet positions, had performed a solo piece she'd choreographed herself at the Foundation's annual showcase. As Grace watched from the audience, she saw not just a talented child, but a living embodiment of Elizabeth Sterling's dream, a world where every child could dance, where talent was nurtured regardless of zip code or bank account, where art belonged to everyone who needed it. After the performance, Amelia had run to Grace and thrown her arms around her waist, saying, "Miss Grace, when I grow up, I want to help kids like you help me." In that moment, Grace understood that the true measure of her second act wouldn't be the accolades or recognition, but the seeds she'd planted in young hearts, the cycles of generosity and possibilities she'd set in motion. As she prepared to leave her apartment for what would be her final day as Grace Washington, tomorrow she'd be Grace Chen, married to a man who saw her worth without needing her story explained. She thought about the letter she'd received that morning from a janitor in Seattle. The woman had seen Grace's story on the news and had written to say that she'd started taking dance classes again after 30 years, inspired by the reminder that it's never too late to reclaim pieces of yourself you thought were lost forever. Grace folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her purse, adding it to the collection of similar messages she'd received from people around the country who'd found courage in her example. Each letter was a reminder that her story had become larger than her individual experience, that her moment of choosing dignity over safety had given others permission to value themselves more highly. Walking toward the elevator that would take her to her new life, Grace reflected on the strange mathematics of grace itself, how moments of cruelty could become catalysts for compassion, how endings could transform into beginnings, how the lowest points of human experience could become the foundation for the highest expressions of human possibility. She'd learned that grace wasn't just something you received, it was something you practiced, something you offered to others even when they hadn't earned it, something that multiplied when shared. The elevator doors opened, revealing her reflection one more time before she stepped inside. Grace Washington, former prima ballerina, former invisible janitor, current foundation director, future wife, eternal example of the truth that it's never too late to dance again, smiled at the woman in the mirror and whispered the words that had become her daily prayer. Thank you, Elizabeth, for teaching me that every ending is just a new beginning in disguise. Friends, Grace's journey reminds us that our worth isn't determined by our job title or bank account, but by how we choose to treat others and ourselves. At 55, 60, or 68, we still have chapters to write, dreams to pursue, and people to lift up. Sometimes our greatest impact comes not from our successes, but from how we handle our setbacks with grace and dignity. What dreams have you set aside that might be worth revisiting? When was the last time you recognized the invisible people who make your daily life possible? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.